Welcome to History in Ashes. You've arrived at a place where the fragments of time, sometimes forgotten and sometimes buried, are gathered, examined, and retold. Today, we step into one of the darkest corridors of human history, slavery in America. It is a history that does not merely rest in the past, but still shapes the foundations beneath your feet. Before we walk further, let me place before you some unsettling truths. At the height of American slavery, there were nearly 4 million enslaved men, women, and children living within the borders of the United States. That meant that 1 out of every 8 people in the country was not free. The sheer weight of that number is almost beyond comprehension. Imagine the streets of a growing city, shops buzzing, carriages moving, families gathering, and then picture that in every cluster of 12 people, 1 lived without rights, without ownership even of their own name. What makes this even more startling is the time span. From the early 17th century until the end of the Civil War, slavery endured in America for more than 240 years. To put it in perspective, that is longer than the United States has existed as an independent nation. Slavery was not a brief or passing phase. It was a structure upon which the nation was built, brick by brick, life by life. And then there is this chilling fact. During the transatlantic slave trade, more than 12 million Africans were forced across the ocean, and nearly 2 million died during the journey itself. Their bodies were thrown into the sea, turning the Atlantic into what some historians grimly call a graveyard without markers. Even those who survived carried scars that lasted for generations. You see, slavery was not merely about chains and labor. It was about erasure of identity, language, family, and history. An enslaved person could be sold 3 or 4 times in their lifetime. Their children taken, their spouse lost, their homeland only a distant memory buried under layers of forced silence. This is where our story begins. It is not an easy story, but it is a necessary one. Now, before we continue, could I ask you something simple? If you're listening right now, go down to the comments section and tell me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. It always fascinates me how history weaves us together across time zones and oceans. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing to History in Ashes. Think of it this way. Once upon a time, people didn't exactly get a choice about joining a system. Subscribing to this channel, however, is one of the few choices you do get to make today. And I promise, it comes without chains. Let's return to the early days of slavery in America, because it didn't appear all at once, fully formed. It began quietly, almost as a shadow in the corners of colonial life, tied to labor, profit, and survival in a new land. In the year 1619, a group of 20 Africans arrived in Virginia. They were not the first Africans in the Americas, but they were the first recorded in what would later become the United States. At first, they were treated in ways not entirely distinct from indentured servants, men and women from Europe who worked under contract for several years in exchange for passage, land, or money. But over time, laws shifted, attitudes hardened, and the practice of lifelong, inherited slavery began to take root. The colonists, struggling to survive in a harsh environment, needed labor. Tobacco, which became Virginia's golden crop, demanded a workforce that seemed endless. At first, Europeans filled this role, but soon it was Africans who were forced into it. The reason was not just labor, it was permanence. An indentured servant eventually gained freedom, an enslaved person did not. That difference transformed America's future. And yet, it was not simply a matter of economics. It was also a matter of control, of building a society where one group was elevated by the subjugation of another. Laws began to draw lines that hardened over time. By the late 17th century, slavery was no longer an uncertain status. It was written into the very codes of the colonies. Children of enslaved mothers were automatically enslaved themselves, ensuring the continuation of bondage for generations. Marriage between races was outlawed. Punishments grew harsher, and the distinction between servant and slave became permanent, racial, and absolute. What is most unsettling, perhaps, is how ordinary this became. Plantation ledgers listed people the same way they listed livestock. Advertisements for runaway slaves were placed in newspapers between notices for lost dogs and land sales. Courts debated not whether slavery was right or wrong, but how best to regulate it. In other words, the system became mundane, a part of daily life, no longer questioned, only managed. Yet, even in the face of this overwhelming power, enslaved people carved out spaces of resilience. They built families where they could, even knowing the risk of separation. They sang songs that carried hidden meanings. They remembered fragments of language, customs, and stories from Africa, weaving them into a culture that survived despite every attempt to erase it. You can almost hear it, can't you? A mother whispering a lullaby to her child in a tongue she half remembers. A man stealing a moment by the fire to carve a pattern into wood, a mark of something familiar in a world determined to strip him of identity. History records the policies, the laws, the trade numbers, but what often slips through the cracks are these small moments of defiance, quiet but unbreakable. As we walk forward in this story, keep in mind that slavery did not simply happen to a people. It was endured, resisted, and survived. The enslaved were not merely victims of a system, they were human beings who carried memories, faith, humor, and love into places where the world tried to extinguish them. So, as we move deeper, let me leave you with a question. When a society decides to normalize the unthinkable, how does it affect not only the oppressed, but also the very soul of the oppressor? If you close your eyes for a moment and picture the early 17th century, what do you see? Perhaps the damp wooden hull of a ship creaking as it rocks on restless waves, the smell of salt air mixing with sweat, tar, and smoke. Now imagine arriving on the shores of a raw, struggling settlement in Virginia, a place where survival itself seemed uncertain. This is where the story of slavery in America begins in earnest, with the first recorded arrival of Africans in 1619. The ship that carried them was called the White Lion, a vessel that sailed not under English colours but as a privateer. Its cargo was unusual, not the usual spices, sugar or timber, but 20 human beings taken from a Portuguese slave ship. They were exchanged in Virginia for supplies, and thus began a chain of events that would stretch across centuries. What is striking here is how casual the exchange seems in the records, almost like an ordinary trade, as if lives could be weighed and measured alongside barrels of food. At first, their legal status was not entirely clear. Some of these Africans were treated like indentured servants, bound to labor for a set number of years, with the possibility of eventual freedom. Others were not. Over time, however, the blurred lines hardened into something permanent, and it was in this subtle shift that the institution of slavery took its earliest American form. The Virginia colony at that time was fragile. The settlers faced hunger, disease, and the uncertainty of carving out life in a land both rich in resources and resistant to their survival. Tobacco was quickly discovered as a crop that could thrive here, but tobacco was demanding. It exhausted the soil, required constant attention, and devoured labor. European indentured servants filled some of the gap, but the colony needed more hands, and it needed them indefinitely. That was when the seeds of race-based slavery found fertile ground. The Africans who arrived were not passive figures in history, though the records often reduce them to little more than numbers or vague descriptions. One man's name survives, Anthony, who later became known as Anthony Johnson. He earned his freedom after years of labor and even owned land. For a time, he lived as a free man in Virginia, a reminder that in these early years the system was not yet fixed in place. But Anthony Johnson's story also reveals the tragedy of its evolution. Within a generation, opportunities like his nearly vanished, as laws increasingly restricted freedom for Africans and their descendants. By the mid-17th century, the shift was unmistakable. Children born to enslaved mothers were automatically enslaved themselves. That single legal decision transformed slavery from a temporary condition into a permanent, inherited one. Suddenly, it was not only the individual who was bound, but their children and their children's children. A system that had once seemed ambiguous became hereditary, racial, and absolute. Think for a moment about what this meant for daily life. A man working under indenture might look ahead to a future of independence, his years of labor leading to land or wages. An enslaved man, by contrast, looked ahead to nothing but continuation, no end date, no promise of change. His children, no matter how innocent, were destined to inherit his chains. That weight of inevitability is difficult to fathom, but it defined the lives of countless families. The colonies beyond Virginia quickly took note. Maryland, the Carolinas, and eventually Georgia all embraced slavery as a cornerstone of their economies. Each new law, each court decision tightened the net. Runaways were hunted down and punished. Interracial marriages were outlawed, and the distinctions between servant and slave became ironclad. And yet, the story is not only about loss. Even in those earliest days, resistance appeared. Some fled into the forests, seeking refuge among Native American communities. Others rebelled, sometimes violently, though such efforts were brutally suppressed. Many resisted in quieter ways through songs that carried hidden meanings, through teaching their children fragments of their lost languages, through the persistence of faith and hope in places designed to extinguish both. The arrival of the first Africans also introduced a deep contradiction into American life, one that would only grow more pronounced. The colonists saw themselves as builders of a new world, a land of opportunity and freedom far from the constraints of Europe. And yet, at the very foundation of that dream, they bound others in chains. The irony would not be lost in later years, when the rhetoric of liberty clashed with the reality of slavery. But in these early days, it was survival and profit that spoke loudest. Consider the irony of Anthony Johnson once more. He gained his freedom, owned land, and even, according to records, held indentured servants of his own. But when disputes arose over land rights, courts began to strip away protections for Africans, free or enslaved. His descendants eventually lost their claims entirely, their status eroded by laws that no longer recognized their place in society. His life, which began with possibility, became a symbol of what was being denied to those who looked like him. By the late 17th century, slavery had ceased to be an uncertain shadow. It had become a codified system. Colonies passed detailed slave codes that regulated every aspect of life: work, movement, marriage, punishment. To read these codes today is to glimpse the machinery of control being assembled, piece by piece. And though they may seem like dry legal documents, they reveal how ordinary governance was used to entrench extraordinary cruelty. But pause here for a moment. If you were living in those years, perhaps as a small farmer or a merchant in Virginia, how would you see it? Would you question it? Or would you accept it as part of the fabric of survival? When does necessity blur into acceptance, and acceptance into justification? These are not abstract questions. They speak to how societies normalize what once seemed unthinkable. The arrival of those 20 Africans in 1619 was not just an event. It was a beginning, a point from which laws, customs, and entire economies would grow. It reminds us that systems of oppression rarely arrive all at once. They grow slowly, through small decisions, practical justifications, and the quiet turning away of those who might otherwise resist. So as we close this part of the story, consider this. If slavery began as a shadow in the margins of colonial life, what allowed it to expand until it consumed the very heart of the American economy? By the late 17th century, slavery in America was no longer a vague status defined by circumstance. It was becoming a carefully written system, shaped by statutes, codes, and court decisions. What began with a handful of Africans in Virginia grew into an institution sustained not only by labor and profit but by law itself. The difference is crucial. Laws gave slavery permanence. They transformed it from a practice into a foundation. The first laws were deceptively simple. In 1662, Virginia passed a statute declaring that children born to enslaved mothers would inherit the status of their mother. It might look like a short line of legal text, but it carried enormous weight. By placing status along the maternal line, the colony ensured that slavery could reproduce itself naturally. No longer was it something that ended with a life. It would continue with each new birth. This law transformed human bondage into something generational, binding not only individuals but entire families to a future of enslavement. Other laws quickly followed. In 1667, baptism, once thought to grant freedom, was explicitly ruled not to change a person's condition. The colonies wanted to close every door that might allow escape from bondage. By the 1680s, Virginia's slave codes spelled out restrictions in detail. Enslaved people could not gather in large groups, carry weapons, or strike a white person, even in self-defense. The punishments for resistance ranged from whipping to execution, while the protections for enslaved lives were minimal at best. Maryland and South Carolina soon enacted their own codes. In South Carolina, a colony heavily dependent on rice cultivation, enslaved Africans made up the majority of the population by the early 18th century. Laws there reflected the fear of rebellion. Patrols were established to monitor plantations, curfews restricted movement, and brutal punishments were used as deterrents. These laws were not written only to preserve order. They were written to preserve power. Think about what this meant for daily life. The law did not simply regulate people, it defined them. A white colonist reading the codes saw them as rules for managing labor, for protecting property. An enslaved person reading, or more often, hearing about the same codes, would see a cage being built, each bar hammered into place by words inked on parchment. The system became not just physical but psychological, convincing both ruler and ruled of what was possible and what was forbidden. One of the more insidious aspects of these laws was their ordinary language. They did not shout cruelty, they whispered it. They resembled the regulations for trade, inheritance, or land use, blending into the rhythm of colonial governance. That was perhaps their greatest power, to disguise extraordinary injustice within the ordinary workings of society. Court cases reinforced the codes. In one case from the 1640s, a Virginia court ruled that John Punch, an African man, was to remain enslaved for life, while 2 European indentured servants, who had run away with him, were sentenced to additional years of service but not to permanent bondage. This decision established a racial divide in punishment, setting precedent that Africans could be bound for life. Each case that followed built upon the last, until the law itself no longer left space for ambiguity. Even free Africans found their rights shrinking. They faced restrictions on property ownership, limits on testifying in court, and prohibitions against marrying Europeans. Freedom itself became fragile, easily challenged, and eroded. The story of Anthony Johnson's family, once prosperous landowners, is a telling example. Within a generation, their land was taken through legal maneuvering, and their descendants faded into the background of a society unwilling to recognize their rights. It is tempting to see these laws as inevitable, as if the rise of slavery was simply the natural course of events. But nothing about them was inevitable. They were written, debated, and passed by individuals, colonial assemblies, governors, judges who made choices to privilege profit over justice, control over compassion, permanence over flexibility. Each statute represented a decision to close one more door, to cement one more link in the chain. The English crown, too, played a role. By the late 17th century, the Royal African Company held a monopoly on the trade of enslaved Africans to English colonies. The laws in Virginia and the Carolinas did not exist in isolation. They were part of a larger imperial system that saw slavery as an engine of wealth. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean and tobacco fields in Virginia were connected by the same legal and economic logic. For enslaved people, these changes were felt in every aspect of daily life. A child born on a plantation now faced a future already decided. A mother's baptism, once a source of hope, no longer carried the promise of freedom. The law recognized a white man's strike against a black body, but not the reverse. Resistance became ever riskier, requiring secrecy, strategy, and immense courage. And yet, resistance persisted. Enslaved people continued to run, to fight, to preserve their cultures in hidden corners. But the legal net was tightening, making escape more dangerous and rebellion more deadly. The laws served not only to punish but to remind, to press into every mind the permanence of the system. If you stand back and look at this moment in history, you can see a society reshaping itself. The early colonies had begun as fragile experiments in survival, filled with uncertainty and improvisation. By the late 17th century, they were transforming into something more structured, more stable, and slavery was becoming one of the pillars holding them up. It was not just an economic system, but a legal one, built word by word, case by case, until it seemed unshakable. And this raises a difficult question for us to carry forward. When injustice is written into the law, how does it change the way a society sees right and wrong, not only for those who suffer under it, but for those who benefit from it? If the laws of the colonies wrote slavery into permanence, the plantations were where those laws came alive, breathing into every moment of daily life. To understand slavery in America, you must not only look at the statutes and the numbers, but also at the ground itself, the soil, the cabins, the tools, the rhythms of days that stretched endlessly for the enslaved. Here, history is not abstract. It is tactile, filled with the details of survival. Picture the plantation of the 17th and 18th centuries. At the center often stood the planter's house, built with wood or brick, sometimes modest, sometimes grand. Surrounding it were outbuildings, kitchens, smokehouses, barns, and, at the edges, the slave quarters. These were crude cabins, usually built of rough logs, with little insulation against heat or cold. Roofs might be made of wooden shingles or thatch, and the interiors were sparse. Dirt floors, a fireplace if fortunate, crude furniture often built by hand from leftover timber. Privacy was rare, comfort rarer still. The diet of enslaved people was simple, repetitive, and designed for efficiency rather than health. Cornmeal formed the backbone of meals, often boiled into a porridge. Salted pork, beans, and greens filled out the diet when available. On some plantations, rations were issued weekly measured portions of food meant to last until the next distribution. Hunger was common, and many enslaved families supplemented their rations by growing small gardens, fishing, or trapping small animals when permitted. These small patches of earth, carved out behind cabins, became vital spaces of both survival and autonomy. Clothing was issued sparingly, usually once or twice a year. Simple garments of coarse cloth linen in summer, wool in winter were provided, often ill-fitting and uncomfortable. Children frequently went unclothed until adolescence, not because their parents wished it, but because clothing was too scarce to be wasted on fast-growing bodies. Shoes, when given, were stiff and rough, worn until they fell apart. In the harsh winters of Virginia or the Carolinas, frostbite and illness followed. The work defined everything. From sunup to sundown, enslaved men, women, and children labored under overseers who measured productivity in pounds of tobacco, bushels of rice, or rows of cotton. In the Chesapeake colonies, tobacco fields required endless attention. Planting, weeding, cutting, drying. In the Carolinas, rice cultivation demanded grueling labor in swampy fields filled with mosquitoes, water snakes, and disease. Sugar, in the Caribbean colonies linked to American trade, was even worse, with long hours at boiling vats so hot that men fainted where they stood. Cotton would rise to dominance later, but the cycle of exhaustion was much the same wherever you looked. Punishment was constant, both as discipline and as spectacle. Whippings were public, meant to remind others of the consequences of disobedience. Branding, shackling, and mutilation were also used in some places. Even minor infractions, working too slowly, speaking out of turn, attempting to escape, could bring brutal consequences. Yet punishment was not only physical. Families could be torn apart as a form of control, children sold away from parents, spouses separated. The threat of separation hung constantly over enslaved communities, often more terrifying than the lash itself. And yet, within these oppressive structures, enslaved people carved out a life that was their own. In the evenings, after the fields had emptied and the overseers retreated, cabins came alive with voices, songs, and whispered stories. Music played a profound role, rhythms drawn from African traditions, blended with new influences, creating spirituals that carried hidden meanings. A song sung in the field might seem like a hymn to an overseer, but could hold coded instructions for escape, or simply the shared strength of endurance. Language, too, evolved as a means of survival. African words and phrases mixed with English, creating new dialects that preserved fragments of lost homelands. On the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, the Gullah culture emerged, with its unique language and traditions, a living testament to resilience under conditions designed to erase identity. Families, fragile and vulnerable to the auction block, still formed the core of enslaved life. Marriage was not legally recognized, but couples pledged themselves in ceremonies often performed within their communities. Parents taught their children not only survival skills but also pride, songs, and memories of heritage. Even when families were torn apart, those bonds remained powerful, carried in stories and in names whispered across generations. Religion, too, became a refuge. Many enslaved Africans brought with them spiritual practices that blended with Christianity over time. The result was a deeply personal faith, rooted in the promise of eventual deliverance. Biblical stories of bondage and freedom resonated strongly. The tale of Moses, leading his people out of Egypt, became a central narrative of hope. In secret gatherings, sometimes called hush harbors, enslaved people prayed, sang, and preached in defiance of rules that restricted their worship. These gatherings were more than religious meetings. They were spaces of solidarity, community, and resistance. The daily life of an enslaved person was shaped by contradiction. On one hand, their labor and bodies were treated as property, reduced to numbers on ledgers and entries in account books. On the other hand, they lived fully human lives, falling in love, raising children, creating music, practicing faith, laughing, mourning, and dreaming. That humanity, though denied by their masters, could not be extinguished. For the enslavers, life was shaped by a different rhythm. The plantation owner often saw himself as a patriarch, ruling over a household that included not only his family but also dozens or hundreds of enslaved people. Wealth was measured in land and in human bodies, each name in the ledger a line of capital. Overseers, hired to enforce discipline, stood between owners and the enslaved, carrying out punishments and driving productivity. It was a world built on control, profit, and hierarchy, and it required constant reinforcement to prevent collapse. To read the journals of plantation owners is to see how normalized this system became. They wrote of crop yields, of weather, of debts and profits, with enslaved people listed alongside cattle and tools. Rarely did they record the inner lives of those they held in bondage, though fragments sometimes emerge notes about illness, about disobedience, about sale or purchase. For them, the enslaved were not neighbors, not fellow humans, but property to be managed. But history teaches us that what is left unsaid often speaks the loudest. In the songs remembered, in the oral histories passed down, we catch glimpses of lives lived within these harsh conditions, lives that refuse to be reduced to property alone. A child clutching a handmade doll, a father carving a wooden flute, a mother braiding her daughter's hair while whispering stories of ancestors. These moments, small and ordinary, carried immense weight. They were acts of resistance, reminders that even under bondage, people remained more than what the system claimed them to be. It is easy to let the numbers numb us to speak of 4 million enslaved people at the height of slavery without pausing to feel the weight of a single life. But if you imagine one cabin, one family, one day of labor from dawn to dusk, and then multiply it by millions of days and generations, the scope becomes overwhelming. Slavery was not simply an institution. It was an experience lived minute by minute, body by body, soul by soul. And so we return to the paradox at the heart of early plantation life. A world where the enslaved were treated as tools, yet continued to live as people resisting erasure through the very act of surviving each day. So let me leave you with this thought. If a system is built on the denial of humanity, what does it mean when those denied find ways, however small, to preserve and express that humanity anyway? If you want to understand why slavery in America grew from uncertain beginnings into a massive institution, you must follow the money. Behind the cabins, the overseers, and the endless fields, there was an economic engine turning. Tobacco, rice, indigo, cotton, and sugar were not merely crops, they were currencies of empire. And at the heart of their cultivation was enslaved labor, exploited with ruthless efficiency. Tobacco was the first great driver. In the 17th century, Virginia and Maryland discovered that tobacco thrived in their soil. European demand was insatiable. Smoking, snuff, and pipes filled the parlours of England and beyond. And every leaf had to be planted, harvested, dried, and packed by hand. Indentured servants provided labour in the earliest years. But tobacco exhausted land and required a constant workforce. Africans, forced into bondage, became the solution. By the early 18th century, tobacco exports reached millions of pounds annually, and enslaved labour was the invisible foundation beneath that wealth. Rice followed, particularly in South Carolina and Georgia. If tobacco was tedious, rice was punishing. Fields had to be flooded and drained in precise cycles, requiring knowledge of water management that many enslaved Africans already possessed from regions like West Africa. Planters quickly realized this expertise was invaluable, and they exploited it. The labor was backbreaking, ankle-deep in water for hours, under the sun, with disease-ridden mosquitoes swarming. Yet rice became a staple export, enriching the colonies and cementing slavery's role in their prosperity. Indigo, a plant that produced rich blue dye, added another layer. It required less labor than rice or tobacco, but provided high value for European markets. In the mid-18th century, indigo exports surged, especially from South Carolina. Once again, enslaved people provided the labor, planting, harvesting, and processing the crop into cakes of dye shipped across the Atlantic. And then came cotton. For a long time, cotton was grown only in small amounts because removing seeds from the fibers was painstakingly slow. But in 1793, Eli Whitney's cotton gin changed everything. Suddenly, cotton could be processed quickly, and demand skyrocketed. The Deep South transformed into a sea of cotton fields, stretching from Georgia through Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. By the mid-19th century, cotton accounted for more than half of all American exports. The phrase "King Cotton" was no exaggeration, and behind every bale shipped to the textile mills of England and New England were countless hours of enslaved labor. Sugar, though more dominant in the Caribbean than the mainland, was still part of this economic web. Its cultivation was notoriously brutal, requiring continuous labor around the clock to harvest, crush, and boil cane before it spoiled. Mortality rates among enslaved workers in sugar regions were staggering. Though less central to mainland America, sugar profits fueled the same transatlantic system that bound colonies, Europe, and Africa together. This web of crops and commerce was known as the triangular trade. Ships sailed from Europe carrying manufactured goods, guns, textiles, alcohol traded in Africa for enslaved people. Those people were carried across the Atlantic in the horrific Middle Passage, sold in the Americas, and their labor produced the raw materials, cotton, tobacco, sugar, that returned to Europe. It was a cycle of profit built on human suffering, each leg of the journey reinforcing the others. Numbers tell part of the story. By the late 18th century, the value of American exports was overwhelmingly tied to slave-produced goods. Cotton alone, by the 1850s, made up 2/3 of American exports. In cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, merchants, insurers, and shipbuilders profited from the trade even if they never owned a plantation. Northern banks financed Southern slavery. Textile mills in New England spun Southern cotton into cloth. Wall Street grew in part on bonds backed by enslaved lives. In short, slavery was not just a Southern institution, it was national. But behind the numbers lay human cost. Each pound of tobacco meant hours of labor in fields under watchful eyes. Each bushel of rice meant swollen feet and aching backs in muddy water. Each bale of cotton meant hands cut raw by sharp bowls. Each shipment of sugar meant another sleepless night feeding cane into boiling vats. The profits glittered in the ledgers of merchants and planters, but they were paid for in sweat, blood, and shortened lives. Even the scale of wealth reveals contradictions. Planters lived in mansions built with enslaved labor, their portraits painted, their children educated abroad. They considered themselves refined, genteel, leaders of society. Yet the foundation of that refinement was enforced by whips, shackles, and auctions. The grandeur of plantation houses was always shadowed by the cabins of those who made them possible. The economy of slavery also created hierarchies within enslaved communities. Some worked in the fields, exposed to the harshest conditions. Others served in the big house as cooks, maids, or nannies. Skilled artisans, blacksmiths, carpenters, seamstresses sometimes earned privileges or small wages, though still under bondage. These divisions were often exploited by enslavers to sow mistrust or resentment, but within the community, people forged solidarity, sharing food, stories, and resistance strategies. One overlooked detail is how slavery tied America into global politics. European nations relied on American exports, particularly cotton, to fuel their industrial revolutions. The mills of Manchester in England, for instance, were fed by cotton picked in Mississippi. International trade agreements, naval power, and colonial rivalries all intersected with the question of slavery. To dismantle it was not just a moral issue but an economic one, threatening fortunes and entire industries. It is important, too, to remember that enslaved people themselves understood this economy. They saw the wealth their labor created and the poverty they endured. Some resisted by slowing their work, breaking tools, or feigning illness. Others escaped, depriving their enslavers of labor altogether. Economic exploitation was met with economic resistance, however subtle. If you walk through the ruins of a plantation today, you might see the remains of the grand house, the rows of trees lining a drive, the outlines of fields. But if you look closer, you will find the remnants of slave quarters, the brick foundations of kitchens, the shallow depressions where gardens once grew. These are the places where economics met humanity, where the grand figures of history built their fortunes on the daily, grinding toil of the enslaved. The rise of slavery as an economic force also hardened its defenders. Planters argued that their prosperity benefited not only themselves, but also the colonies, the nation, even the world. They claimed that without slavery, there could be no tobacco for Europe, no rice for export, no cotton for the mills. Wealth, they argued, required bondage. Such arguments ignored the cost paid in lives, but they reveal how deeply the economy and slavery were intertwined. By the time the 18th century gave way to the 19th, the link was nearly unbreakable. Slavery was no longer just a system of labor, it was the beating heart of the American economy. To challenge it meant challenging the fortunes of planters, merchants, banks, and nations alike. And so, as we close this part of the story, let me ask, if wealth and prosperity are built on injustice, can they ever truly be separated from the suffering that made them possible? When you think of slavery, it is easy to imagine an unbroken chain of suffering, submission, and silence. But that would be misleading. From the moment the first Africans were enslaved on American soil, there was resistance. Sometimes it was violent and open, other times it was quiet, hidden in the folds of daily life. What binds all of it together is the refusal to accept bondage as natural, even in the face of overwhelming power. The most obvious form of resistance was rebellion. One of the earliest recorded uprisings was the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina in 1739. A group of enslaved men, many of them from Central Africa, armed themselves and marched south towards Spanish Florida, where freedom had been promised to any who escaped English colonies. Along the way, they killed several whites and recruited other enslaved people to join them. Militia forces eventually caught up, and the rebellion was crushed brutally. Yet the memory lingered. It terrified slaveholders and inspired whispers among the enslaved. It was possible to fight back. Other rebellions followed across decades, each shaped by its moment. In 1791, the Haitian Revolution erupted in the French colony of Saint-Domingue. Enslaved Africans rose up and, after years of struggle, created the first free black republic in the Western Hemisphere. The shockwaves traveled everywhere, including America. Planters trembled at the thought of Haiti's example taking root on their soil. For enslaved communities, Haiti was a beacon of hope, proof that victory, though costly, was possible. In the American South, smaller revolts were more common than large-scale wars. In 1819, Denmark Vesey, a free black man in Charleston, was accused of organizing a massive rebellion involving thousands of enslaved people. Authorities discovered the plan before it unfolded, and Vesey was executed along with many others. Whether the plot was as large as officials claimed remains debated, but the fear it provoked was real. Then, in 1831, Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia sent shockwaves through the nation. Turner, a deeply religious man who believed he was chosen by God to strike against slavery, led a group that killed around 60 white people in a series of coordinated attacks. The revolt was crushed, and Turner was executed, but the consequences were far-reaching. Southern states tightened laws, restricted gatherings, and intensified surveillance of enslaved communities. Yet among those communities, Turner's defiance became legend. But rebellion was only one kind of resistance, and it was rare because it was so dangerous. More common were the quiet acts that chipped away at the institution's control. Breaking tools was one method axes dulled, hoes snapped, plows mysteriously bent. Feigning illness was another, slowing the pace of work. Work itself could be a form of protest. By moving slowly, singing at a rhythm that set the pace, or pretending to misunderstand instructions, enslaved people carved out slivers of agency. Escape was another powerful form of resistance. Not every attempt was successful, but each one represented a refusal to accept captivity. Some fled into the woods temporarily, hiding until punishments cooled, a practice known as lying out. Others sought permanent freedom, heading north toward free states or even further into Canada. The journey was perilous, with slave catchers, dogs, and bounty hunters in pursuit, but thousands made it. The Underground Railroad, a network of safe houses and allies, helped some along the way. Figures like Harriet Tubman became legendary for guiding dozens to freedom, despite the immense risks. Cultural resistance was perhaps the most enduring. Enslaved people carried with them songs, stories, and spiritual practices that preserved identity and dignity. Spirituals, for example, often doubled as coded messages. Songs about crossing rivers or seeking Canaan hinted at escape routes or the dream of freedom. Folk tales, like those of Brer Rabbit, taught lessons of wit and survival, celebrating cleverness in the face of stronger adversaries. Religion, whether Christianity adapted to enslaved experience or African traditions carried across the ocean, offered strength, comfort, and community. Family itself was a form of resistance. Though enslavers frequently broke apart families through sale and trade, enslaved people created bonds wherever they could. Marriage, though not legally recognized, was sacred within their communities. Parents taught children skills, values, and songs that preserved continuity across generations. To love one another in a system designed to erase humanity was an act of defiance. Even literacy became a battlefield. Laws often forbade teaching enslaved people to read or write, fearing that literacy would breed rebellion. Yet many found ways to learn. Some were secretly taught by sympathetic whites or free blacks. Others taught themselves using discarded newspapers, books, or the Bible. With literacy came power, the ability to forge passes, to understand contracts, to read abolitionist literature. For enslavers, knowledge was dangerous. For the enslaved, it was a weapon of survival. There were also subtler forms of cultural endurance. Hairstyles, foodways, and language carried memories of Africa. Enslaved cooks introduced dishes that blended African, native, and European traditions, shaping what we now think of as Southern cuisine. Words and rhythms slipped into the English language, evidence of a heritage that could not be erased. Every meal prepared, every story told, every dance performed was a reminder: we are still here. Resistance was not only individual but collective. Enslaved people built mutual support networks, looking after each other's children, sharing scarce resources, and caring for the sick. These acts, small in scale, sustained communities under relentless pressure. Survival itself, in the face of a system designed to destroy both body and spirit, was a form of resistance. To enslavers, such defiance was infuriating. They wanted compliance, but what they often got was a constant low hum of resistance. It forced them to create harsher laws, more brutal punishments, stricter surveillance. Yet the resistance never stopped. It was woven into the very fabric of daily life, unrecorded in official documents but remembered in songs, stories, and scars. And so when we think of slavery, we should not think only of chains and suffering, but also of resilience and defiance. For every plantation ledger recording profits, there were songs sung in the fields carrying secret meanings. For every law passed to restrict literacy, there were hands tracing letters in the dirt at night. For every rebellion crushed, there were dreams of freedom kept alive in whispered prayers. The story of slavery in America is not only about what was done to people, but also about how those people refused to be broken. And that refusal, that insistence on humanity, would lay the groundwork for movements to come, from abolition to civil rights and beyond. So I leave you with this thought. In a world where resistance seemed impossible, what does it mean that people still found ways to fight, to love, and to hope? When you think of law, you may picture justice, order, or fairness. But in the early history of America, law was often the tool that bound slavery more tightly to the nation's fabric. Enslavement was not simply tolerated, it was codified, legalized, and protected by governments that claimed to value liberty. The roots of legal slavery stretch back to the 17th century. In the colony of Virginia, early labor systems blurred lines between indentured servitude and slavery. At first, Africans could sometimes earn freedom after years of labor, much like white indentured servants. But by the 1660s, laws began to draw sharp distinctions. One law declared that the status of a child would follow the mother, not the father. That meant if an enslaved woman bore a child, that child was enslaved for life. It was a deliberate break from English common law, crafted to ensure the perpetual growth of slavery. Over time, other laws cemented the system. Enslaved people were stripped of rights. They could not testify against whites in court. They could not carry weapons. They could not assemble in groups without permission. They could not legally marry. Any challenge to a white person's authority could be met with brutal punishment, sanctioned by law. In some colonies, even the killing of an enslaved person during correction was not considered a crime. By the 18th century, every colony had its own slave codes. These codes varied in detail but shared the same purpose: to reduce enslaved people to property. In South Carolina, the codes were especially severe, restricting movement and granting masters almost total control. In the North, slavery also existed, though on a smaller scale, and laws there likewise upheld ownership and restricted freedom. The idea of human beings as chattel, as movable property, became embedded in the legal structure. As the colonies fought for independence in the 1770s, the contradiction became glaring. How could men write of liberty and equality while owning other human beings? The Declaration of Independence's famous words did not apply to the enslaved. Some founders, like Thomas Jefferson, acknowledged the hypocrisy yet continued to profit from slavery. Others, like John Adams, opposed slavery but compromised for the sake of unity. The result was a founding moment in which freedom was proclaimed but denied to millions. The Constitution, ratified in 1788, carried these contradictions forward. Slavery was never named outright, but it lurked in key clauses. The 3/5 compromise counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation, giving slaveholding states more political power. The fugitive slave clause required that escaped slaves be returned, even if they reached free states. The Constitution allowed the importation of enslaved people to continue until 1808, postponing the question for 2 decades. These compromises reveal how deeply the system was protected at the nation's birth. In the early 19th century, as America expanded westward, the question of whether new territories would allow slavery became a flashpoint. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, drawing a line across the map to divide future territories. It was an uneasy balance, a political attempt to manage an institution too vast to ignore but too entrenched to dismantle. Other laws tightened slavery's grip. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 and its harsher successor in 1850 gave slaveholders the right to pursue escaped slaves across state lines. The latter law forced citizens of free states to assist in capturing fugitives under penalty of law. For many Northerners who might have tolerated slavery at a distance, this brought its cruelty to their own streets. Free black people lived under constant threat of being seized and sent south, whether or not they had ever been enslaved. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 marked another devastating moment. Dred Scott, an enslaved man, sued for his freedom after living in free territory. The Supreme Court not only denied his claim but went further, declaring that black people, free or enslaved, had no rights that white people were bound to respect. The ruling effectively opened all territories to slavery and stripped away any illusion that law could serve as a shield for the enslaved. Yet while laws crushed freedom, they also provoked resistance. Northern states gradually passed emancipation acts, though often slow and partial. Abolitionists attacked the Fugitive Slave Act, sometimes forming mobs to rescue captured fugitives. The Underground Railroad flourished despite the legal risks, and enslaved people themselves continued to resist, even when the law declared them property. The entanglement of law and slavery reveals something uncomfortable, that injustice can be perfectly legal. Courts, legislatures, and constitutions did not just permit slavery, they sustained it. Judges enforced slave codes, sheriffs chased runaways, Congress passed compromises that valued union over justice. To challenge slavery was not only to oppose individual masters, but to confront an entire legal system built to protect them. One might be tempted to think of history as progress, with law moving steadily toward freedom. But here, law lagged behind morality. It clung to compromise, delayed justice, and enshrined inequality. Only immense pressure from resistance, abolitionist activism, and eventually civil war would force it to change. If you were alive then, how would you see it? Would you have trusted the law as a safeguard, or would you have recognized it as a weapon turned against the powerless? When a system is as vast and entrenched as slavery was in America, challenging it can feel impossible. Yet across the late 18th and 19th centuries, a chorus of voices began to rise. They were preachers, writers, escaped slaves, politicians, and ordinary citizens who saw in slavery not an economic issue or a regional tradition but a moral wound. Their efforts were not always unified, nor were they free of contradictions, but together they created a movement that chipped away at the justifications of bondage. The earliest abolitionist stirrings came in religious communities. Quakers, also known as the Society of Friends, were among the first to condemn slavery outright. As early as the 1750s, Quaker meetings in Pennsylvania urged members to free their slaves, and by the end of the century, they had made slaveholding incompatible with membership. Their commitment to equality, rooted in religious belief, gave abolitionism a moral backbone. The rhetoric of the American Revolution also inspired anti-slavery thought. If all men were created equal, how could millions be enslaved? In the North, gradual emancipation laws began appearing after independence. Pennsylvania passed one in 1780, followed by states like Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New York. These laws often freed children born to enslaved mothers after a certain age, meaning slavery phased out slowly, sometimes over decades. Still, they represented cracks in the institution. By the early 19th century, abolitionism took more organized form. Societies dedicated to ending slavery sprang up in cities across the North. The American Colonization Society, founded in 1816, promoted the idea of sending freed black people to Africa, establishing the colony of Liberia. While some saw colonization as a path to freedom, many free blacks rejected it, arguing that America was their home and they had no desire to leave. This tension revealed a key divide. Was abolition about true equality, or merely the removal of slavery without changing racial hierarchies? Voices of the enslaved themselves reshaped the conversation. Frederick Douglass, who escaped slavery in Maryland, became one of the most powerful speakers and writers of his time. His autobiography, published in 1845, laid bare the brutality of slavery in a way few white audiences could ignore. Douglass's eloquence demolished claims that enslaved people were uneducated or incapable. Each speech he delivered, each page he wrote, was itself an act of defiance against the system that had tried to silence him. Harriet Jacobs offered another perspective. In her book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, published in 1861, she recounted the unique struggles faced by enslaved women's sexual abuse, the anguish of motherhood under bondage, the desperate measures she took to protect her children. Her story revealed dimensions of slavery often ignored in political debates, reminding readers that behind every argument were real human lives. Print culture became one of abolition's sharpest weapons. Newspapers like William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator, launched in 1831, demanded immediate emancipation. Garrison's uncompromising stance, "I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice," shocked moderates but galvanized radicals. Pamphlets, tracts, and broadsides circulated widely, carried in pockets and pinned on walls, spreading anti-slavery sentiment across towns and cities. Meetings and lectures gave the cause a human face. Abolitionist societies organized gatherings where speakers often escaped slaves told their stories. Audiences wept, raged, and sometimes left transformed. Women, often excluded from political life, found space in the movement. Figures like the Grimke sisters, daughters of a South Carolina slaveholding family, became outspoken critics of the institution. Their voices linked the fight against slavery with the early women's rights movement, planting seeds for struggles yet to come. Of course, the movement was not without opposition. Many in the North, though not slaveholders themselves, feared that emancipation would disrupt the economy or bring waves of freed black workers into their cities. Riots sometimes broke out against abolitionists. Meeting halls were burned. Even in Congress, gag rules were passed to prevent anti-slavery petitions from being read. Yet every attempt to silence the cause only seemed to strengthen its resolve. Resistance also grew in the South, where abolitionist literature was banned and mail carrying such materials was seized. Speaking against slavery could mean exile or worse. Yet underground, whispers spread. Every letter smuggled, every pamphlet hidden in a coat pocket, was a small victory against the silence imposed by law and fear. The abolitionist movement was diverse in strategy. Some argued for moral persuasion, believing that once Americans saw slavery for what it was, they would end it voluntarily. Others demanded political action, forming parties like the Liberty Party in the 1840s and later the Free Soil Party, which opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories. For some, colonization remained a goal. For others, only full equality would suffice. The movement's strength lay in this diversity, even if it sometimes fractured its unity. Perhaps the most powerful form of persuasion was the testimony of those who had lived slavery. Each story undermined the myths of happy plantations and benevolent masters. Each narrative revealed the cruelty that official documents hid. It is telling that slaveholders worked so hard to silence these voices, for they understood their danger. Once the truth was heard, it could not be unheard. By the middle of the 19th century, abolitionism had moved from the fringes to the center of national debate. It divided churches, split political parties, and pushed the country toward confrontation. Even those who did not fully embrace it could no longer ignore it. Slavery, once treated as a necessary evil, was being exposed as a moral abomination that stained the very ideals on which America was built. And so we must pause to consider, how does a society built on injustice come to recognize that injustice is intolerable? What combination of voices, courage, and persistence does it take to shift the course of history? By the middle of the 19th century, slavery was no longer simply an economic system or a regional practice. It had become the central question of American politics, a question that refused to be silenced by compromise. Every new territory, every legislative debate, every election seemed to return to the same issue. Would the United States remain half slave and half free, or would the balance tip irrevocably toward one side? The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had temporarily quieted the conflict by drawing a line across the nation above it. Slavery was forbidden. Below it, permitted. For decades, that line held an uneasy truce between North and South. But as America expanded westward, swallowing vast new lands after the Mexican-American War of the 1840s, the compromise began to crack. The question could not be avoided. Would these new territories be free or slave? The Compromise of 1850 attempted another patch. California entered as a free state, but in exchange, the South won the harsh Fugitive Slave Act, which required Northerners to return escaped slaves. This law inflamed tensions. In northern towns, free black citizens lived in fear of being seized, while abolitionists railed against being forced to act as agents of slavery. The sight of fugitives dragged through northern streets under armed guard shocked many who had previously tolerated slavery at a distance. Then came the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which shattered the old Missouri line. Instead of prohibiting slavery outright, it allowed settlers in new territories to decide for themselves a principle called popular sovereignty. The result was chaos. In Kansas, pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers clashed in what became known as Bleeding Kansas. Towns were burned, lives were lost, and the territory became a violent microcosm of the national struggle. Politics grew bloodier too. In 1856, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts gave a fiery speech denouncing slavery. Days later, he was brutally attacked on the Senate floor by Preston Brooks, a South Carolina congressman who beat him nearly to death with a cane. The assault shocked the North and delighted many in the South, showing how deeply the issue had poisoned even the halls of government. New political movements arose in this turmoil. The old Whig Party collapsed under the strain, and in its place emerged the Republican Party, founded in the mid-1850s on the principle of stopping the spread of slavery into new territories. Though not all Republicans called for immediate abolition, their opposition to expansion was enough to ignite Southern fears. For many Southerners, any limit on slavery's growth threatened their way of life and economic survival. The Supreme Court deepened the crisis in 1857 with the Dred Scott decision. By ruling that black people could never be citizens and that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in the territories, the court seemed to hand victory to the South. But in doing so, it enraged the North, convincing many that the nation's institutions were rigged in favor of slavery. In the midst of this turmoil came voices that sharpened the debate. Abraham Lincoln, a lawyer from Illinois, entered the national stage during his debates with Senator Stephen Douglas in 1858. Lincoln argued that a nation could not endure permanently half slave and half free. While he stopped short of calling for immediate abolition, his insistence that slavery must not spread electrified the North and alarmed the South. Meanwhile, radicals pushed further. In 1859, John Brown led a raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His goal was to spark a massive slave uprising. The raid failed, and Brown was captured and executed. Yet his defiance made him a martyr in the North, and a symbol of Northern aggression in the South. The idea that Northerners would arm enslaved people against their masters deepened Southern resolve to defend slavery at all costs. By 1860, the nation was a tinderbox. When Abraham Lincoln won the presidency that year without carrying a single Southern state, many Southerners saw it as proof that they no longer had a voice in the Union. Secession soon followed, beginning with South Carolina in December of 1860, and quickly spreading to other Southern states. The Confederacy was born, declaring its purpose openly, to preserve slavery and the social order built upon it. The United States, a nation that had prided itself on compromise, had reached a breaking point. Decades of legislative deals, court rulings, and political maneuvering had only postponed the inevitable. Slavery was not an issue that could be papered over. It was a question that cut to the very heart of the nation's identity. Was America truly a land of liberty, or was it a land built on bondage? And so, as war loomed on the horizon, Americans faced a choice that would define their future. Could a nation survive with such a deep moral fracture at its core, or was conflict the only path left? By the time the first shots of the Civil War rang out at Fort Sumter in April of 1861, slavery had already shaped the contours of the conflict. It was more than a moral issue, more than an economic one. It was a defining feature of Southern society, the engine of its economy, and a central factor in the strategic calculations of both the Union and the Confederacy. To understand the war, you must understand how the institution of slavery permeated every level of military, political, and civilian life. In the Confederacy, the preservation of slavery was explicit. State declarations of secession often cited the protection of the institution as a primary justification. South Carolina's Ordinance of Secession, for example, stated plainly that the non-white population was held as slaves, and that maintaining this system was vital to the state's prosperity and social order. To the Confederates, defending slavery was defending their identity, their economic model, and their way of life. The Union, at the start, faced a more complicated calculus. Abraham Lincoln and his cabinet were aware that ending slavery outright at the outset of war might alienate border states like Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland, where slavery still existed but loyalties were divided. Military strategy and political caution initially tempered moral imperatives. Lincoln himself spoke of preserving the Union first, emancipation second, though he privately recognized the moral dimensions of the conflict. Yet enslaved people themselves would not wait. From the very beginning of hostilities, enslaved men and women recognized the war as an opportunity to claim freedom. Along rivers and railroads, enslaved people fled toward Union lines. Knowing that the armies advancing into the South might offer protection, they carried nothing but the clothes on their backs, their families, and hope. The term contraband emerged as a legal designation for these escapees, implying that they were seized property of the Confederacy, but in reality, it was a first step towards self-liberation. The Union's early strategies began to adapt to this reality. General Benjamin Butler, stationed at Fort Monroe in Virginia in 1861, declared that escaped slaves reaching Union lines would not be returned to their enslavers, labeling them contraband of war. This pragmatic approach acknowledged the human reality of slavery, while also providing a tactical advantage. By sheltering fleeing enslaved people, Union forces both weakened the Confederate labor force and gained manpower in the form of guides, laborers, and later soldiers. Work on plantations and in Confederate towns changed dramatically as a result. Enslaved men and women left fields, workshops, and homes, joining the Union wherever possible or sabotaging work before fleeing. Crops went unharvested, rail lines were disrupted, and logistical support for Confederate armies weakened. Every act of flight, every piece of resistance, became part of the larger war effort. The enslaved were not passive victims of history. They were active agents shaping the course of events. By 1862, the question of emancipation became unavoidable. Lincoln's preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, announced in September of that year, declared that on the first day of January 1863, all enslaved people in states still in rebellion would be forever free. The proclamation was limited in scope. It did not immediately free enslaved people in border states or in territories under Union control, but its symbolic and strategic impact was profound. It reframed the war as not only a struggle to preserve the Union, but also a struggle for human freedom. The proclamation also had practical effects. Enslaved men rushed to enlist in Union regiments, forming the United States Colored Troops. By the end of the war, nearly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors had fought for the Union, their courage and labor altering both the course of battles and the perception of African Americans' role in society. Each man carried the weight of history in his uniform, proving both loyalty and humanity in the face of decades of dehumanization. Life for enslaved people in the Confederacy during the war was a brutal mixture of coercion, survival, and opportunity. The Confederate government attempted to maintain control by enforcing conscription of labor for fortifications, road building, and crop production. Women managed plantations, raising families, and organizing labor in the absence of men, often under threat of violence. Communities adapted. Churches and mutual aid networks became essential for survival, offering food, information, and spiritual support. The war also exposed the fragility of the Southern economy. With vast numbers of enslaved people fleeing and soldiers away at the front, plantations could not maintain production. Food shortages spread, inflation skyrocketed, and Confederate armies struggled to supply themselves. The very system that had enriched the South for decades was now undermining its capacity to fight. Slavery, once the source of strength, had become a liability under the pressures of conflict. Union military strategy increasingly leveraged this reality. General Ulysses S. Grant and other commanders encouraged enslaved people to flee plantations, knowing that every laborer lost to the Confederacy weakened its war effort. These measures were both practical and moral. They allowed the Union to demonstrate commitment to emancipation while simultaneously destabilizing the Confederate economy. By the end of the war, it was clear that freedom and military strategy had become inseparable. The human dimension of emancipation is also remarkable. For millions, The first days of freedom were bewildering and terrifying. Families long separated by sale or flight struggled to reunite. Formerly enslaved people needed shelter, food, and guidance in navigating a world that had long denied them agency. Freedmen's camps emerged, often crowded and unsanitary, yet also spaces of education, organizing, and resilience. Teachers, often northern missionaries, arrived to establish schools, recognizing that literacy was central to sustaining freedom. And yet freedom did not erase the scars of bondage. The psychological toll of generations under slavery, combined with the ongoing dangers of war, shaped every decision. Women and children faced unique hardships, often left to care for communities while men fought or traveled to reach Union lines. Men who had been enslaved grappled with new responsibilities and opportunities, learning trades, managing land, and negotiating contracts for the first time. Every step toward autonomy required courage, patience, and endurance. The end of the war in April of 1865 brought formal liberation with the ratification of the 13th Amendment. Slavery was abolished across the United States, yet the work of freedom was just beginning. The legal system, the economy, and social structures were all still deeply entwined with centuries of bondage. For millions of formerly enslaved people, the challenge was survival, not merely freedom on paper. Even amid victory, the question of justice remained unresolved. What responsibility did the nation owe to those who had labored for generations under brutality? How could a society that had depended so long on the denial of humanity now ensure equality, dignity, and opportunity? These questions would echo through Reconstruction, the Jim Crow era, and far beyond, showing that liberation is not a single moment, but a continuous process. Slavery during the Civil War demonstrates the agency of those who had been denied it. Enslaved men and women did not wait passively for political decisions. They acted, fled, resisted, and fought. They reshaped the conflict in real time, transforming a war initially about union into a war about freedom. Their courage forced the nation to confront its contradictions and, ultimately, to take steps, imperfect though they were, toward justice. So consider this. In a war defined by armies and politics, how much of its outcome was determined not by generals or legislatures, but by the millions of people whose lives had been denied, yet who seized freedom with both hands the moment opportunity arose. The guns fell silent in April of 1865, and the Confederacy lay in ruins. Yet for the millions of formerly enslaved people, the end of war did not mean the end of struggle. Freedom, though now legally recognized through the 13th Amendment, came with challenges that were immediate, practical, and deeply personal. Families were torn apart, land remained in the hands of former enslavers, and the Southern economy had collapsed. Reconstruction became the nation's attempt to reconcile these contradictions, to translate freedom from law into lived reality. From the outset, Reconstruction was a battlefield of politics, ideology, and power. The federal government faced the question of how to reintegrate Southern states while ensuring rights for those newly freed. President Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln after his assassination, favored leniency toward former Confederates. He offered rapid restoration of property, excluding enslaved people, now freed, and limited protections for the newly emancipated. Southern elites, many of whom had fought to preserve slavery, were quickly restored to positions of influence. Johnson's policies reflected a common belief among white Americans that social hierarchies should remain intact, even if slavery itself was gone. Meanwhile, Congress took a more assertive approach. Radical Republicans, alarmed by Johnson's leniency, pushed for legislation that would protect African Americans' civil rights. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 declared all persons born in the United States, except Native Americans, to be citizens, granting them equal protection under the law. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, enshrined these rights in the Constitution. Voting rights for black men followed with the 15th Amendment in 1870. These measures were revolutionary in intent, though enforcement proved uneven. Education became a cornerstone of Reconstruction for the newly freed. Freedmen's Bureau schools were established across the South, staffed by Northern teachers and missionaries who often risked hostility and violence. For adults who had been forbidden to read or write under slavery, these schools offered a chance to reclaim agency, to understand contracts, politics, and the broader world. Literacy was not just a skill, it was empowerment. Children attended schools that would shape a new generation, one that could demand rights and envision life beyond servitude. Land ownership, however, remained a persistent challenge. 40 acres and a mule became a symbol of promised restitution, but in practice, very few freed people received land. Most remained dependent on sharecropping or tenant farming arrangements that closely resembled slavery in economic terms. Landowners retained control, and debt cycles trapped laborers in systems of coercion. Yet even under these conditions, African Americans developed communities, churches, and institutions that fostered solidarity and self-determination. Resistance to Reconstruction policies was fierce. White supremacist organizations, most notoriously the Ku Klux Klan, emerged to intimidate, terrorize, and suppress black political participation. Violence was rampant. Homes were burned, men and women were beaten or lynched, and local governments often turned a blind eye. Despite federal laws and military enforcement in some regions, the threat of brutality was constant. Reconstruction was not merely an exercise in legislation, it was a war of survival for the newly freed. Political participation became both a triumph and a battleground. For the first time, African American men voted, held office, and influenced legislation in states like South Carolina and Louisiana. Black senators and representatives took seats in Congress. They advocated for public education, equitable labor laws, and civil rights enforcement. Their achievements were remarkable, considering the obstacles. Yet every victory provoked backlash, fueling campaigns to restore white dominance and dismantle Reconstruction reforms. Daily life for freed people was a delicate balance of opportunity and danger. Families reunited where possible, rebuilding connections torn apart by decades of slavery. Churches became spiritual, social, and political hubs, places where communities organized, educated, and celebrated. Cooperative networks, from mutual aid societies to informal labor-sharing arrangements, provided security in a society still hostile to black autonomy. The struggle for self-sufficiency was relentless, but these efforts laid the foundation for future generations. The economy itself was transforming, though slowly. Sharecropping allowed laborers to work land in exchange for a portion of the harvest, but high interest rates, inflated supplies, and unpredictable yields often left them in poverty. Northern investors and southern elites dominated industry, banking, and trade. While slavery had ended, systemic inequality persisted. Reconstruction revealed that legal freedom alone could not dismantle centuries of economic exploitation. Structural changes were necessary, and many were resisted or delayed. Education, religion, and political engagement created a cultural shift. African Americans developed newspapers, community organizations, and networks that connected them across towns and states. Literacy and civic awareness gave voice to people who had long been denied one. Despite intimidation and violence, these communities built resilience and identity, proving that freedom is not merely a legal state but a lived, cultural reality. Reconstruction's fragility became evident by the mid-1870s. Economic depression, waning northern interest, and political compromises led to the gradual withdrawal of federal enforcement. The disputed presidential election of 1876 and the resulting Compromise of 1877 effectively ended federal intervention in the South. White Democrats regained political control, instituting laws and practices designed to suppress black political participation, culminating in the Jim Crow system. Yet even in retreat, Reconstruction left a legacy. The amendments passed during this period, 13th, 14th, and 15th, provided legal tools for future civil rights struggles. Communities organized during Reconstruction persisted, creating foundations for education, religious life, and political activism. Formerly enslaved people and their descendants carried forward knowledge, resilience, and a vision of equality that would shape American society for generations. The story of Reconstruction demonstrates both possibility and limitation. It shows what can be achieved when a society attempts to redress injustice, and how easily progress can be undermined by entrenched interests and violence. It also highlights the agency of those who had been enslaved, who built institutions, asserted rights, and redefined freedom on their own terms. As you reflect on this period, ask yourself, can legal and political reforms alone ever create true freedom? Or must freedom be continually cultivated by the people who live it? Even decades after the formal abolition of slavery, the shadow of bondage lingered across the United States. The physical chains were gone, but the economic structures, social hierarchies, and cultural legacies, forged under centuries of slavery, continued to shape the lives of millions. The story of America after emancipation is not merely about freedom gained. It is about the struggle to translate legal liberation into real, everyday life. Economically, the South was in turmoil. Plantations that once depended on enslaved labor had to adapt to a new reality. Sharecropping and tenant farming became widespread, systems in which freed people worked plots of land owned by white landowners in exchange for a share of the harvest. On paper, these arrangements offered autonomy. In practice, they often perpetuated cycles of debt and dependency. Landowners controlled supplies and set prices, leaving laborers vulnerable to economic manipulation. Despite the hardships, these systems allowed African Americans to remain on familiar land, maintain communities, and continue cultivating the skills that had been honed under slavery. The migration patterns that emerged during this period were significant. Some freed people sought opportunities in urban centers, while others traveled north or west, hoping to escape the lingering oppression of the rural South. These movements, sometimes called the Exoduster migrations in the late 19th century, reshaped demographics and laid the groundwork for future civil rights activism. Communities developed new institutions, churches, schools, mutual aid societies that provided support, identity, and organization in the face of systemic inequality. Culturally, the legacy of slavery was complex. African Americans preserved traditions from African heritage, including music, storytelling, and religious practices, while also blending them with European and indigenous influences. Spirituals, hymns, and folk songs carried hidden meanings, memories of endurance, and calls for justice. These cultural expressions were not merely aesthetic, they were mechanisms of resilience, communication, and resistance. Black churches emerged as centers of communal life, political activism, and education, becoming both spiritual havens and platforms for social change. Education remained central to this effort. Schools established during Reconstruction, though often underfunded and poorly resourced, laid the foundation for literacy, critical thinking, and civic participation. Formerly enslaved people valued education as a tool of empowerment, recognizing that the denial of knowledge had been a cornerstone of oppression. Generations of African Americans would continue to fight for equitable access to schooling, understanding that intellectual freedom was inseparable from social and economic freedom. Legally, the period after Reconstruction was a battleground. The amendments passed during Reconstruction guaranteed rights in theory, but enforcement was uneven and often absent. State governments in the South implemented black codes and later Jim Crow laws to control and limit the freedoms of African Americans. Segregation, disenfranchisement, and violent intimidation became tools to maintain white supremacy. Yet the very existence of these laws demonstrated a persistent tension. The legal recognition of freedom clashed with societal efforts to deny it. Economically, the nation as a whole also bore the consequences of slavery. Northern industries had profited from southern cotton and the global cotton trade. Wealth accumulated through the labor of enslaved people underpinned banks, shipping companies, and textile mills. Even after emancipation, the disparities in land ownership, wealth distribution, and economic opportunity reflected the advantages accrued over centuries. These structural inequalities were not simply the remnants of slavery, they were its active legacy, shaping power and opportunity long after the last chains were broken. Socially, the aftermath of slavery created a rigid racial hierarchy. Though African Americans were no longer property, they were systematically excluded from political, economic, and social power. Communities developed strategies to navigate these hierarchies, forming networks of mutual aid, self-defense, and political organization. Social norms and expectations imposed by white society limited opportunities, but African Americans found ways to assert dignity, identity, and agency within constrained circumstances. Resistance persisted in cultural, social, and political forms. From informal protests to organized movements, African Americans continuously challenged the limitations imposed upon them. Newspapers, clubs, and civic organizations flourished, advocating for justice, documenting abuse, and preserving history. Figures such as Booker T. Washington emphasized economic self-reliance and vocational training, while W.E.B. Du Bois argued for political activism and higher education. These divergent strategies reflected ongoing debates about the best path toward equality, but both aimed to dismantle the remnants of slavery's influence. The psychological legacy of slavery was profound. Generations lived under the weight of trauma, witnessing brutality and being denied agency. Families were disrupted, communities controlled, and identities suppressed. Healing, education, and cultural expression became methods of reclaiming humanity and passing resilience to future generations. Even in adversity, African Americans cultivated pride, solidarity, and a sense of historical continuity that would carry through civil rights struggles, migration movements, and cultural innovation. At the same time, the wider American society had to confront the contradiction of freedom and inequality. National policies, political debates, and economic decisions continually reflected the tension between ideals of liberty and entrenched social hierarchies. Slavery's legacy influenced everything from labor laws to voting rights to social customs, demonstrating that the consequences of centuries of bondage extended far beyond the formal end of the institution. In the South, sharecropping communities, Black churches and schools became pillars of autonomy and identity. Northern cities saw the rise of vibrant Black neighborhoods, cultural institutions, and political organizations. Migration and mobility allowed African Americans to challenge geographic and social constraints, asserting agency and shaping the cultural and political landscapes of their communities. Music, literature, and visual arts often drew directly from the lived experience of slavery, transforming pain into cultural capital and collective memory. Even decades later, the economic consequences persisted. Land ownership remained limited, wages were depressed, and access to credit was restricted. Segregated schools and discriminatory labor practices curtailed upward mobility. Yet within these constraints, African Americans carved spaces of opportunity, entrepreneurship, and social cohesion. The struggle for economic equity, begun in the immediate aftermath of slavery, would continue well into the 20th century, demonstrating the long shadow of bondage on social and economic life. In examining these legacies, one cannot ignore the role of memory and storytelling. Oral histories, songs, and memoirs preserved the experiences of slavery and Reconstruction. These narratives allowed communities to maintain continuity across generations, honor survival and resilience, and document injustices that legal records often ignored. They provided both evidence and moral force, shaping the consciousness of future generations and influencing movements for equality and justice. The impact of slavery and Reconstruction also shaped national identity. America's ideals of liberty, justice, and equality were tested by the reality of racial hierarchy and systemic oppression. Political debates, cultural expressions, and civic struggles continuously returned to the question of how a nation founded on freedom could reconcile its past with its promises. The tension between ideals and practice became a defining feature of American society, one that continues to influence debates, policies, and social movements today. And so, when we examine the period after Reconstruction, we see both continuity and change. Legal slavery was abolished, but economic and social structures reflected its lingering influence. African Americans built communities, institutions, and cultural practices that transformed their reality, while society at large struggled with the legacy of bondage. The past was neither erased nor forgotten. It persisted in tangible and intangible ways, shaping the nation's trajectory. Reflecting on this, ask yourself, how does a society truly heal from the weight of systemic injustice? Can legal freedom ever be sufficient without cultural, economic, and social transformation? Even after the formal end of slavery and the collapse of Reconstruction, its legacies reverberated across generations. The United States had abolished bondage, but freedom was far from complete. Segregation, economic inequality, and social exclusion continued to shape daily life, especially for African Americans in the South. Yet, amid these challenges, a remarkable story unfolded. Communities, institutions, and movements arose that refused to accept oppression as permanent. These responses would shape the cultural and political landscape of America for decades to come. One of the most visible forms of resistance was cultural expression. African American music, literature, and art evolved in response to both the memory of slavery and the conditions of systemic discrimination. Spirituals, work songs, and later the blues and jazz carried coded messages, told stories of endurance, and celebrated resilience. The Harlem Renaissance in the early 20th century emerged as a flowering of intellectual and artistic achievement, producing writers like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Claude McKay. Their works examined identity, history, and injustice, reclaiming narratives often erased from mainstream culture. Religious institutions continue to serve as both spiritual havens and political hubs. Black churches, long centers of community life, became sites for organizing social and civil rights initiatives. Leaders such as Martin Luther King Sr. and later Martin Luther King Jr. drew on these networks to mobilize communities, emphasizing moral authority, education, and collective action. The church provided continuity, leadership, and a sense of purpose, reminding communities that freedom was not just a legal status, but a moral and social pursuit. Education remained a central battleground. From the establishment of historically black colleges and universities to the creation of public schools in urban and rural areas, access to knowledge was both a tool of empowerment and a site of contestation. African Americans understood that literacy, professional training, and intellectual development were essential for economic independence, political engagement, and the long-term dismantling of systemic inequality. Schools became arenas where history, identity, and aspiration converged. The legal system, however, continued to present barriers. Jim Crow laws enforced racial segregation, limiting access to quality education, public spaces, and political participation. Voting restrictions through literacy tests, poll taxes, and intimidation effectively disenfranchised millions. Lynching and racial violence terrorized communities, making the assertion of civil rights a dangerous endeavor. Yet African Americans persistently challenged these structures, often at immense personal risk, demonstrating the ongoing struggle to transform the promises of emancipation into lived reality. The political movements that emerged were complex and multifaceted. Organizations such as the NAACP, founded in 1906, pursued legal challenges to segregation and discrimination. Leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois argued for immediate civil rights and higher education, while others, like Booker T. Washington, emphasized vocational training and economic self-reliance. Both approaches sought to navigate the realities of a society still deeply shaped by slavery's legacies, demonstrating the diversity of thought within the fight for equality. Grassroots activism became essential. Local communities organized to defend rights, create schools, and support those facing economic and social oppression. Women played a central role in these efforts, balancing domestic responsibilities with political engagement, education, and social work. Their contributions, often under-recognized, were pivotal in building networks of resilience and laying the foundation for later civil rights campaigns. Economic struggles persisted as well. Segregation limited employment opportunities, and systemic discrimination constrained upward mobility. Many African Americans relied on agriculture, domestic work, and small-scale trade, often under exploitative conditions. Despite these constraints, entrepreneurship, cooperative ventures, and mutual aid societies emerged as strategies to build wealth, community stability, and independence. These efforts reflected both resilience and ingenuity, turning adversity into opportunity wherever possible. The Great Migration, beginning around 1906 and continuing into the mid-20th century, dramatically reshaped the social and cultural geography of America. Millions of African Americans moved from rural southern regions to northern and western cities in search of better economic opportunities and to escape racial terror. This migration fueled urban growth, created vibrant cultural communities, and shifted political dynamics, contributing to the eventual success of civil rights activism in later decades. Political activism intensified during the mid-20th century. The civil rights movement, spanning the 1950s and 60s, sought to dismantle segregation and secure voting rights. Grassroots organizing, legal battles, and non-violent protest characterized this era. Landmark legislation, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, represented monumental victories, though the struggle for full equality persisted. The movement drew on the historical memory of slavery, Reconstruction, and continued discrimination, transforming outrage into organized action. Cultural achievements continued to underscore resilience. Music, literature, and film reflected both the history of oppression and the aspirations of communities. Jazz, gospel, blues, and later hip-hop served as both artistic expression and social commentary. Writers, filmmakers, and performers preserved histories, highlighted injustices, and celebrated cultural identity, ensuring that the legacies of slavery remained visible while shaping contemporary life. Even today, the echoes of slavery are evident in economic disparities, social dynamics, and cultural memory. Understanding these legacies allows us to see continuity and change across centuries. The persistence of structural inequality, alongside the enduring contributions and resilience of African American communities. Recognition of this past is essential to understanding contemporary society, politics, and culture. The story of cultural and political mobilization demonstrates that freedom, while legally won, requires constant engagement, vigilance, and creativity. African Americans leveraged institutions, cultural expression, political activism, and grassroots organization to claim agency and influence, demonstrating that the fight for justice is both persistent and adaptive. Reflecting on this, one might ask, how much of modern American society is shaped by the legacies of slavery, and how much by the tireless efforts of those who refuse to be defined by it? How do communities continue to transform memory into power, resistance into progress, and injustice into lessons for future generations? Slavery in America was not just a domestic institution. Its effects radiated far beyond the borders of the United States, shaping global trade, political alliances, and the economic systems of multiple continents. When we consider the history of slavery, it is crucial to understand that its consequences were not confined to the plantations of the South or the legal documents of Congress. It influenced markets in Europe, labor systems in the Caribbean, and even diplomatic negotiations across the Atlantic. From the 17th century onward, American slavery was deeply intertwined with the Atlantic economy. Cotton, tobacco, rice, and sugar produced by enslaved labor fueled international trade. European textile industries relied on raw cotton from southern plantations, while merchants and insurers profited from the shipping of enslaved people and goods. Northern states, often seen as more free, also benefited from slavery indirectly through shipbuilding, finance, and trade. Slavery's reach was global, and its profits were woven into the very fabric of modern industrial capitalism. The triangular trade exemplifies this international entanglement. European merchants exchanged manufactured goods for enslaved Africans, who were then transported across the Middle Passage under brutal conditions. Many perished en route, yet survivors were sold into lifelong bondage, their labor feeding the economic engines of the Americas. Profits returned to European ports, fueling commerce and industry. The Americas became a theater where human lives were commodified, and the ripple effects of this system extended across continents, shaping economies, labor practices, and social hierarchies worldwide. Even after the transatlantic slave trade was banned, Britain in 1833 and the United States in 1808, the legacy continued. Illegal trading persisted, and the economic structures established by centuries of slavery remained entrenched. Plantation economies in the Americas relied on coerced labor, whether through debt, peonage, indenture, or oppressive labor laws. The wealth generated during slavery had long-lasting effects, consolidating land and capital in the hands of a few, while keeping large populations in systemic disadvantage. Politically, slavery influenced national and international negotiations. During the 19th century, the United States engaged with European powers over issues such as trade, territorial expansion, and diplomacy with countries that had already abolished slavery. The moral and economic implications of slavery affected alliances and conflicts. Britain, for example, exerted diplomatic pressure to end the international slave trade, and later pressured for the suppression of slavery globally, even as American institutions continued to rely on it domestically. Slavery was thus not merely a domestic matter. It was a global bargaining chip, a point of contention and influence in international politics. Economically, the profits from slavery helped finance infrastructure, industry, and expansion. Railroads, banks, and urban development in northern states were indirectly supported by money derived from southern cotton. Cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia prospered through trade, shipping, and insurance connected to slavery. In this sense, slavery shaped not only the southern economy, but the national economy, embedding inequality and profit patterns that would resonate for generations. The modern United States owes part of its early economic growth to a system built on coerced human labor, a fact often overlooked in simplified narratives of progress. Culturally, the legacies of slavery influenced literature, philosophy, and social thought across nations. Abolitionist writings in the United States resonated in Europe, inspiring movements that challenged bondage in colonies and elsewhere. Conversely, racist ideologies developed in the Americas, justifying slavery as natural or divinely sanctioned, spread globally, shaping discriminatory laws, practices, and social hierarchies beyond the United States. The moral, intellectual, and cultural reverberations of slavery were as extensive as the economic ones. Even in the 20th century, the echoes persisted. African diasporas in Europe, the Caribbean, and South America bore the influence of forced migration, labor exploitation, and systemic oppression. Cultural expressions, music, religion, cuisine, and storytelling preserved histories of resistance and survival. African Americans' struggle for civil rights, education, and political representation became a model for global movements. From anti-colonial struggles in Africa to civil rights campaigns in the Caribbean, the lessons of resilience, organization, and community built during and after slavery transcended borders. Slavery also shaped legal frameworks and political debates. The moral questions it raised about human rights, citizenship, and equality forced nations to confront the contradiction between freedom and oppression. In the United States, debates over slavery's expansion contributed directly to the Civil War. Globally, abolition movements pressured governments, influenced legislation, and redefined what constituted human rights. The dialogue between morality and law, profit and principle, became a defining feature of the 19th and 20th centuries, illustrating how deeply slavery's influence permeated political thought. Trade patterns were transformed as well. Cotton produced by enslaved labor dominated the global market, creating dependencies between regions and continents. Northern industries, southern plantations, and European textile mills formed an interconnected system that relied on human exploitation. When slavery ended, economies had to adapt, sometimes painfully, revealing how deeply embedded forced labor had been in the machinery of global commerce. Economic legacies persisted in land ownership patterns, wealth distribution, and social stratification, shaping the modern world. Migration and diaspora also had profound effects. Freed Africans and their descendants carried cultural knowledge, agricultural expertise, and resilience across the Americas. Communities in the Caribbean, Brazil, and the United States were shaped by these migrations. The movement of people, ideas, and culture, both forced and voluntary, created networks that transformed societies. Music, cuisine, religion, and politics were all enriched and complicated by these histories, ensuring that slavery's legacy was not erased, but transformed into living cultural memory. Internationally, the moral debates surrounding slavery influenced diplomacy and global policy. Nations that had abolished slavery, like Britain, exerted pressure on others to follow suit. Treaties, naval patrols against illegal slaving, and economic sanctions all reflected the persistent tension between profit and principle. American slavery, both in its practice and its abolition, became part of a broader global discourse on human rights, influencing debates far beyond the continent, yet the legacy was ambivalent. While slavery's abolition represented moral progress, its consequences, economic disparity, racial discrimination, and social inequality persisted. Systems of oppression adapted, finding new forms in sharecropping, segregation, and global labor exploitation. The world inherited both the profits and the burdens of slavery, illustrating that liberation is never purely immediate or universal. Its effects are interwoven into economic, political, and cultural structures, shaping nations and individuals long after the last chains were broken. The story of slavery's global impact demonstrates how local practices can ripple across continents. A cotton field in Georgia, a trading port in Liverpool, a factory in Manchester, all were linked in a system sustained by human labor and human suffering. Understanding this interconnectedness provides insight into contemporary social and economic inequalities, reminding us that historical decisions reverberate far beyond their immediate context. As you reflect on this, consider, how do systems of exploitation shape not only nations but the world economy, culture, and politics for centuries? Can the legacies of such systems ever be fully resolved, or are they carried forward in subtle but enduring ways across generations and continents? As we arrive at the culmination of this story, it is clear that the history of slavery in America is not merely a tale of the past. It is a living narrative that continues to shape the present. From its beginnings in the early 17th century, through its expansion and ultimate abolition, slavery fundamentally molded American society, its economy, and its culture. The echoes of bondage, resistance, and resilience are embedded in the nation's institutions, communities, and collective memory. Slavery in America began quietly yet brutally. Early English colonies, seeking labor for tobacco, sugar, and rice, turned to enslaved Africans as a solution. By the early 17th century, individuals like John Punch in Virginia were subjected to lifelong servitude, establishing legal precedents for race-based slavery. Over time, laws evolved to codify racial hierarchy, stripping enslaved people of rights, mobility, and autonomy. Yet even in these early stages, resistance was present. Africans and African Americans resisted through escape, sabotage, rebellion, and the preservation of culture, asserting agency against overwhelming odds. The institution expanded as the United States grew. Cotton, known as king in the Deep South, transformed both the economy and society. The invention of the cotton gin in 1817 made production vastly more profitable, increasing the demand for enslaved labor. States such as Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana became epicenters of plantation agriculture. Families were separated through sale, individuals faced brutal physical punishment, and entire communities lived under constant surveillance. Yet, amid oppression, African Americans maintained cultural traditions, created networks of mutual support, and developed strategies for survival. Political tensions over slavery intensified as the nation expanded westward. Compromises such as the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850 were temporary measures in a struggle that would ultimately prove irresolvable. Legal decisions like the Dred Scott case exacerbated divisions, denying citizenship and legal rights to black people while inflaming Northern opposition. Debates over popular sovereignty, territorial expansion, and the moral implications of slavery dominated national politics, pushing the country closer to conflict. The Civil War was the inevitable consequence of these tensions. Slavery was both the cause and the lens through which the war was fought. Enslaved people actively shaped the outcome, fleeing plantations, serving as laborers for Union forces, and joining the United States colored troops. The Emancipation Proclamation reframed the war as a fight for freedom, and the bravery of black soldiers and civilians demonstrated their central role in the conflict. By the end of the war, legal slavery had been abolished, but the work of securing real freedom was only beginning. Reconstruction attempted to translate emancipation into lived reality. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments offered a legal foundation for equality, but systemic resistance from black codes to violent intimidation challenged their implementation. African Americans built schools, churches, and communities, asserting agency and building resilience in the face of oppression. Sharecropping and economic exploitation persisted, demonstrating that freedom on paper was insufficient without structural and societal transformation. The cultural legacy of slavery and Reconstruction is profound. Music, literature, and art preserved memory, celebrated resilience, and provided commentary on injustice. Spirituals, jazz, blues, and later hip-hop carry traces of the pain, hope, and ingenuity of generations whose labor built the nation. Writers, activists, and community leaders forged identities rooted in both survival and aspiration, creating institutions that fostered education, civic engagement, and collective empowerment. These cultural achievements transformed adversity into enduring human expression. Slavery's economic impact was not confined to the South. Northern industries, European textile mills, and global trade networks all benefited from the forced labor of enslaved people. Wealth accumulated through slavery shaped the development of cities, transportation networks, and financial institutions. Even after abolition, economic disparities persisted, reflecting the long-term consequences of centuries of exploitation. Understanding these economic patterns illuminates how historical injustices have lasting effects on wealth distribution, labor systems, and social opportunity. Socially, the hierarchies established under slavery endured in different forms. Segregation, discriminatory laws, and systemic oppression limited access to education, employment, and political power. Yet African Americans consistently resisted, creating networks of mutual support, institutions, and organizations that asserted autonomy and challenged inequality. The struggle for civil rights, from the early 20th century through the 1960s and beyond, represents a continuation of the fight begun under slavery and Reconstruction, a fight for recognition, dignity, and full participation in society. Internationally, American slavery had far-reaching consequences. The nation's economy, politics, and culture were entwined with global trade, influencing European economies, Caribbean labor systems, and transatlantic cultural exchange. Abolition movements, diplomatic pressure, and moral debates extended the impact of slavery far beyond the continent. The United States became a site where questions of morality, economics, and human rights intersected on a global stage, influencing international perspectives on labor, freedom, and justice. Education emerged as a cornerstone of progress. Literacy and knowledge were tools for empowerment, allowing African Americans to navigate social, economic, and political systems previously denied to them. Schools, universities, and community programs created continuity across generations, cultivating leadership, critical thinking, and civic engagement. Education became both a means of resisting oppression and a vehicle for asserting equality, reflecting the central importance of knowledge in the struggle for freedom. The psychological and cultural legacies of slavery remain visible today. Trauma, resilience, community identity, and cultural memory continue to influence individuals and communities. Stories of survival, resistance, and creativity provide a framework for understanding contemporary social movements and debates about justice. Slavery's history is not an abstract past. It is embedded in the lived experiences of communities, shaping opportunities, perceptions, and cultural production. Freedom, while legally achieved, remains a continual process. Legal reforms, civil rights victories, and cultural achievements represent progress, yet structural inequalities persist. Slavery's legacy challenges society to confront uncomfortable truths about wealth, power, and human dignity. Recognizing this history is essential not only to honor those who endured and resisted, but also to understand contemporary challenges and responsibilities. As we reflect on the arc of history from the first forced arrivals of enslaved Africans to the cultural, political, and economic struggles of today, we see a pattern of oppression met with extraordinary resilience. Communities adapted, resisted, and thrived within constraints, shaping the nation in ways often overlooked in traditional histories. Understanding slavery as both a historical and living phenomenon allows us to grasp the depth of its impact, the scale of its influence, and the courage of those who lived under it. So, as we conclude this journey through the history of slavery in America, one question remains: how can a society reconcile with a past so deeply entwined with injustice, while using the lessons of resilience, resistance, and community to shape a future that is truly free and equitable? How do we honor those who endured unspeakable hardship while confronting the structures that still echo their struggle today?